And it's a very warm welcome to the Global Business Podcast show today to Mr. Morgan Parker. How are you, mate?
I'm fantastic. Thanks for having me today, Mark.
We were just talking off air, and I could swear that I reckon you've lost about 20 kilos of weight, mate.
Well, I've been training hard, and COVID has given everyone, I guess, an opportunity to take a good hard look at themselves and improve where we can. And even though the circumstances have been changed slightly with gyms closing here in Australia for a couple of months, it actually led me to some fairly innovative training techniques out in the park and a bit more of that cardiovascular conditioning than I'm used to. So I think that's actually been good. As they say, any change is good for the body. Challenges us in a new way, and the body responds.
Yeah, fantastic. So tell us about these new things that you've been doing. What are the new exercises that you haven't been doing in the past?
Well, as that boot camp style training, which has a lot more mobility and movement to it, rather than sitting in a gym lifting weights. I've been doing a lot more running.
Yep.
Getting back to basics, really. I
Yep.
think, and that's a real theme for all of COVID is getting back to basics. And in the context of exercise, running is, I guess, the most basic thing we can do.
Yep.
And it's a great way to condition the body, the mind, and lose a few pounds in the process.
Well, it's been working, mate. So congratulations, because it takes discipline. And for anybody else listening to the show today, Morgan is an exemplary example of commitment and dedication to any task that he takes on in his life. So good work, mate. And thanks very much for coming on the business show today. When I put a list of guests together that I wanted to have on the show, your name was near the top, and I really wanted to get into your mind because we've known each other for a number of years now in different capacities and share a lot of similar views about the world, the people of it, and the businesses of it, and particularly the not-for-profit world as well, which I find always interesting to talk to you about. But today I thought it would be a good opportunity to have a chat about COVID-19 times, because a lot of people around the world are struggling with not only leading their businesses but keeping their businesses afloat. That's a real reality for a lot of people these days. So first of all, why don't we spend a couple of minutes with you giving my audience a good overview of your background in business and what that journey's been like for you. And I'm talking obviously way before COVID-19 came along, because you've worked in different places around the world in different capacities. So why don't you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, look, I grew up in Brisbane in Australia and graduated with a law degree, but never practiced law. Got quickly into investment banking, in particular real estate banking. Worked a lot in commercial development. Ended up traveling around the world, mostly spending my time in Asia. I've lived in 9 different countries over the last 25 years, and I've done about 65 different real estate projects, office buildings, golf courses, hotels, shopping centres, you name it, and really found myself quite fortunately positioned in Asia at a time where that part of the world was experiencing tremendous growth, of course, led by the Chinese phenomenon that we've all experienced over the last 20 or 30 years. That part of my career came to an end a couple of years ago, where for family reasons, I decided to pivot in my life to a non-executive career where I now help out 6 different companies serving on their board of directors. And that has been a fascinating experience for me to go from sort of day in, day out executive duties where you can become singularly focused on the objectives of that company and the people in that company, to now having to have a level of intellectual agility to shift from industry to industry, sector to sector, different CEOs, different management teams across that portfolio of 6 different companies. What it does do is give me a tremendous amount of exposure, if you like, to the ways that different management teams respond to challenges. And COVID, I guess, is quite a unique situation where, unlike other crises that we've faced, it sort of affects everyone. In the global financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis, SARS, all things that I've experienced firsthand in my career, they tended to affect certain sections of the community disproportionately to others. So there were always parts of society that were sort of carrying on unaffected. Whereas I think this is certainly the sort of the first time in my life that we've had a challenge for all of humanity. and faced in different ways, of course, but faced by all.
We're going to get on and talk about that, but I'm also interested to know about your background in terms of all the things that you've learned, not only living around the world but working around the world. How do you think those experiences have combined to make you into the human being that you are today, having so many different business and life experiences combined?
Yeah, look, I found myself, for most of my adult life at least, being a minority in a foreign country. And I think, on reflection, I would say that it's caused me to be a person that seeks to communicate in a whole of person way. Being unable to use language all the time to communicate has the impact of causing you to become more proficient in nonverbal communication. And if you do that long enough, you become quite proficient in conveying messages to people via gesture or tone and or inflection. You also become an incredible listener as you're searching for understanding when you're sitting in a meeting being conducted in a foreign language, which no doubt you can appreciate as well. And I think also you develop a level of diplomacy. Most of my life, I've been involved in cross-border transactions, cross-cultural transactions, and asymmetrical situations in terms of relative experience or capability, where you're in new emerging markets trying to do things that are quite pioneering in nature. And that requires a lot of patience and a lot of empathy. So it builds you into an executive over the course of time that has a lot of those soft skills that you can't learn in a book or you can't learn at university. You just learn it through trial and error and by experience. And now I think that's allowed me to, deploy a humanity and a sensibility to organizations that, quite frankly, has become quite the trend, really, is to focus more on the people. If we can focus on the people and focus on finding mutually beneficial outcomes through every situation, then the business results follow. So I guess I've gone from being fairly commercial at the beginning of my career, thinking it was all about profitability, and that was the measure of success, to actually understanding that it's about making a difference in the world, and bringing that sensibility and mindset to the work environment. And fortunately, we live in a time where more and more people are appreciating that is really the mark of success.
Yeah, fantastic. A lot of really great things that you shared there. I'd like to throw a hypothetical at you, because I got asked this question yesterday. Actually, I thought I'm going to ask Morgan that because I want to see what his answer is. The question is, if you hadn't left Brisbane and taken off on this global escapade of life that you've been living over the number of years, what do you think you'd be doing today if you had stayed in Australia?
Oh, wow, that's a really tough question. And I now being back in Brisbane after being away for over 2 decades, I look at people who've had a tremendously successful life just staying here, and I think, wow, if I had done that, wonder what would have become of me. It's one of those hypotheticals that's very difficult to answer, because in life we make these decisions which end up being forks in roads, and then they lead to another set of decisions that in turn lead to another set of decisions. And when you look back on that path, it's hard to calculate. It's sort of mind-boggling to calculate where you could have ended up. I would have liked to have thought that I would have been able to, have the opportunity to contribute to the society here in business, in philanthropic ways. It's a different environment in Australia. Australia being, of course, a very wealthy, successful country that's quite well developed, quite mature, if you like, in terms of the business environment. And that sort of is quite scary to me in some ways, in that I wonder if I could have made the difference that I was able to make by going to another part of the world where everywhere you looked, every day of the week, you're able to try and contribute in a positive way, because those countries are really striving to evolve. So people who are there to help those countries achieve that tend to be in the slipstream of opportunity.
Hmm.
And I don't know whether I would have been able to achieve that here.
Yeah, really interesting reflection. And I think when one looks back on a journey like that, when you actually come back to your native country after being away for so long, there's a lot of different emotions attached with that as well, isn't there? You know, there's that psychology around, oh, I don't fit into my own country, and I've got to rebuild, I guess, my credibility and a lot of other aspects in terms of human connections. And you know, I probably see you as the head of Rugby Australia if you hadn't left Australia and taken off around the world, and that wouldn't have been a bad thing either. But I think there's the other side too, and I think you were being rather diplomatic in your answer, so I'm going to say it for you. In terms of, you can come back and feel a little bit isolated because people here who have lived their whole life haven't had that international experience, and that's not a judgment call. That's just an observation to say, hey, look, we've been on different paths. My path has taken me around the world and given me exposure to lots of different things that a lot of people don't get to see and feel. And that's not being arrogant in my response to that. It's basically being truthful and saying, well, if it wasn't for those things, and I'm sure you would say to me that you don't regret any minute of any of that international experience that you had because it's made you into the person you are today.
Yeah, no doubt. I think the story of returning expats, whether you're British, American, Canadian, Australian or Kiwi, is becoming better understood as more people do it. Of course, the last 20 or 30 years has probably been a period of great mobility of human talent, where people have been most inclined to travel overseas to ply their trade, if you like, than at any other time in our history. So consequently, you've now got a greater number of people returning to their home base than we've probably ever had before. So as a society, we're coming to understand that people have had different journeys, and in that diversity, there's been a range of different experiences. It is incredibly difficult returning, I've got to say. What you find is that there's a general lack of interest in what people have done abroad when you come back. And I put it down to one of the most basic fundamental human emotions, and that's one of fear of the unknown.
Absolutely.
And when people aren't able to share an experience with you or truly understand it, there's a tendency to shy away from it. And we're all guilty of doing that for things that we don't truly understand. And what I've learned is just to sort of turn that part of me off and, as you say, rebuild and adjust. And I think that ability to adapt is fundamental to humans. And one of the great things that I've enjoyed becoming better at is sort of adapting. Every new country that I've gone to live and work in, I've challenged myself to adapt. And adaptation is the great thing about our species, really, isn't it?
Yep.
No matter the challenge, no matter the conditions, we find a way to persevere and prosper.
10 years ago, when I walked out of the corporate life and the expat life at the same time, and I thought, well, now's a good opportunity to set up a rehab clinic for expats around the world who are going home, because I really think it's an issue. And I've seen a lot of people that I used to work alongside who've been repatriated, and they've really, really struggled. Like, you know, it's to a large extent, as you would appreciate, it's a bubble world, isn't it, that you live in that environment. And it does a lot of things to you, I think, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, that, you know, only challenge you when you return back to your native environment. We could talk about that all day, but I want to talk about some of the things that you've been witness to during these COVID-19 times. Before we get into that, though, let's talk about the beginning of this year and before COVID came along. How did this year look for you? What were the plans in terms of business and some of the visions that you had to deliver on for the 12 months heading in from January 2020?
Look, there was an enormous amount of optimism in the world coming out of 2019. 2020 was always going to be a big year for me. The year was about the Olympics in Tokyo. It was about the presidential election in the United States. And for me personally, it was about really knuckling down and trying to make some positive contributions to the 6 boards that I'm involved with. Now, in each and every one of those cases, those organisations had, plans that were reflective of a relatively stable economic environment. Certainly in Australia, a period of growth was anticipated. Interest rates at a very low level. relatively high levels of consumer optimism, a fairly stable political environment, relatively speaking, of course, and the platform for a new decade of opportunity. And 2020, even just in simplistic terms, almost has that sort of futuristic label to it. For people of our age, to sit here and say you're in 2020, it's just got this exuberance about it, I guess. Sounds silly, but you know what I mean. It was just the beginning of a new era, if you like. And of course, all of that came crashing down. In specific terms, I'm involved on the board of Newcastle Airport in New South Wales in Australia, which is a really important airport in regional terms in that state. It's the second biggest airport after Sydney Airport in New South Wales, and tremendous growth in that area of Australia, with the Hunter Valley wine region becoming more and more popular, more and more wine going offshore, incredible advanced manufacturing. It's also the home to the Joint Strike Fighter, RAF, the Air Force base in Australia, the most sophisticated planes that we have in this country, and all of the industry associated in the supply chain for the Joint Strike Fighter creates commercial opportunities for the owner of a airport. And so we were planning wonderful things. We've got steady passenger growth over the years ahead, a really well managed business, and airports, quite frankly, it would be hard to imagine another business more dramatically affected by COVID-19 than the airport. We'll come back to that, but then in other sectors, I'm involved in real estate, commercial real estate. I'm involved in building a new city in Australia on the Sunshine Coast, which is one of those sort of 20-year projects. The types of things that I've been involved in Korea and China and the UAE in my career, and the opportunity to build a new city doesn't come along that often in Australia. So fortunately, those sorts of ambitions are very long term. And when you start to think about business, and one of the things the Chinese are, I guess, famous for is their long-term perspective. And I guess that's rubbed off on me. I always think, in 10, 20, 30, 40, even 50-year perspectives. And I try and bring that to every organization that I'm involved in. So when you're building a new city, you can't allow the conditions of the moment to affect your ambitions and your plans for the long term, because when you set out to do something that's going to take 20 years, by definition, you're going to have periods where economic wins are in your favor and then periods of great challenge. Just the cyclical nature of the world that we live in. When I got involved in the ownership and operation of 4 different schools here in Queensland, I'm now the chair of this organisation. We have 5,000 students, roughly 1,000 staff, and these 4 campuses. The year was shaping up to be full of optimism. The schools are incredibly vibrant, exciting places to be around. All of the schools have got great plans of what they're going to be doing in the future. I was trying to bring that long-term vision of what education is going to look like in the future, and could be the subject of a whole nother podcast right. About where education's going.
Yep.
And I've learned an enormous amount being around these wonderful educators and experts in this field.
Yep.
And really trying to challenge ourselves to be ready, if you like, and be agile enough to adapt as education evolves over time. Who would have thought we'd need to be so agile that we needed to actually adapt in the most fundamental way we've ever had to do just a couple of months later?
It's really interesting what you're talking about, because your roles on each of these boards is very much a visionary, consultant in terms of looking at where these organisations are going to be medium to longer term. And as you're rightly saying now, that the whole carpet was pulled out from under your feet very quickly, literally overnight, when you're talking about an airport scenario in Newcastle, right? So how did that how did that transition, or how quickly did that transition happen for all the things that you're involved in? And what was your immediate first steps in the process in terms of, communication and bringing the stakeholders together to find out, this is what we're going to do now?
Well, in every instance, it was dramatic across all of these organisations, incredibly dramatic. But I got to say, and I'm not just plugging the companies when I say this, but the CEOs across all of these different organisations have just impressed me so much with their ability to pivot and adapt to the COVID challenge in every instance. And a lot of them have had the right focus from the absolute first moment, and that was about the welfare of their people and the welfare of the sustainability of the business, if you like, the welfare of the business, and in that order. And I think that the communication that CEOs and the like have demonstrated has really been an example of why those people are in the right place at the right time in those roles. And it goes to the heart of the importance of finding leaders in business that have the full package of skills, so that when they are challenged to the extreme, that their ability to respond in an appropriate way is never in doubt. We all look to our leaders for that calmness and that confidence in moments of crisis. That's well understood. And what I was able to observe across all of these organisations was a great deal of poise and empathy at just the right time. From a board perspective, our workload and our cadence of meeting really accelerated. Boards tend to meet sort of once a month, maybe 10 times a year, really, in most places around the world. So what we saw was that frequency dramatically accelerate to weekly or fortnightly meetings, which was reflective of just how quickly things were changing. Now, particularly in sectors like aviation and education, which were directly affected by government decision making. And as we all experienced, no matter where we are in the world, our governments were trying to make decisions based on the information that they were able to procure, and those decisions were coming very, very quickly, and it was a very dynamic period of time. So as businesses and as boards, we were trying to adjust to those different operating environments, always with the sustainability, the long-term sustainability of the business in mind, and then the short-term crisis unfolding for our people, our suppliers, our customers, and ensuring that clear communication and really sticking to the framework of our values as an organisation was front and centre.
I guess because you're across 6 different organisations, that there are things that were unique to each situation, but there were other things that were common to each situation as well. Can you highlight some of those for us?
Yeah, this is really in business terms, COVID is a crisis of revenue. It's different to economic crisis, which may have other aspects to them, like credit crisis that we saw in 2008, 2009. So this is essentially a total and utter collapse of confidence, and for many businesses, a collapse in revenue. So it goes to the heart of how your business has been managed, what the risk profile is of the business that you're operating, to the extent to which you hold cash. What level of gearing do you have in your business? Are you highly leveraged and therefore got a banking relationship that's now going to be under duress? All of those factors start to get amplified when you have a crisis of revenue. So I think across the board, putting aside education, education's unique in that people have made a choice to be in an independent education with their children, and the desire is to really keep that going. So as a result, that business tends to have quite a sticky customer base, if you could call the families that. Whereas commercial businesses, people really were looking to preserve revenue and identify any areas of non-essential cost. So that was consistent across all of these groups. How do we identify those things that we cannot do or defer, delay in order to preserve cash? so that this hit, no matter how long it is, we can make it out the other side. So I saw a lot of innovation, and I think we saw broad-based stand downs of people where there are opportunities to ask people to take annual leave or defer a maintenance program or a nice to have but not a need to have type initiative. Those things were very quickly shelved, not forgotten, but just shelved for the time being, so that we could get our cash burn rates in each of these businesses down to the lowest level feasibly possible, without undermining our people, without undermining the values of the organisation, and without compromising the people that rely upon us.
So you talked about the I guess express nature that the government decisions were coming. They're almost coming on a daily basis to start off with. And you said you were getting together on a weekly basis. How far forward were you planning at those weekly meetings? Were you just saying, look, let's survive to next week, or let's put something in place till next week and reconvene again and see what the government's passed down?
The government in Australia actually put out a fairly robust set of guidelines and plans, which served really as a framework, if you like, for businesses to contemplate how that framework related to their specific business. So there's a lot of information out at that time. There were a lot of advisory firms, law firms, accounting firms. It seemed like everyone was trying to help and create a level of intellectual consensus around how organisations should cope with this degree of change. So I don't think we were ever starved of know-how. It was about having the judgment to ascertain what were the correct policies to put in place for a specific organisation. So we were meeting weekly, focused on the next week, focused on the things that we can control, not sweating the things that are the uncontrollables, not getting too far out ahead of ourselves, optimistic, sort of planning for the worst, hoping for the best was the sort of mindset that people on boards and in C-suite roles had. We're doing a lot of contingency planning. We were talking about phases, the going into the crisis, the phase of being in the crisis, and then the recovery phases. So we always planned for that sort of into, sustaining a existence during a crisis, and then always having a recovery in mind. Yep. The importance of having recovery in mind is that light at the end of the tunnel, because we do know that at some point we're going to be recovering. What I've deliberately not said is the durations associated with each of those three phases. But we can almost certainly say that there are those three phases as we go into something, as we exist in it, and then as we come out of it. And that's really important for the psychology of an organisation and the people in it, and that you're able to create the flexibility to survive in each of those phases as long as is necessary. We also tried to understand how the medical advice associated with the virus would affect government decision-making, and how government decision-making would affect society and the economy. And there's almost sort of a linking of these four elements: the medical stuff, the government decision-making, society, and economy. And each of them is interconnected. And we spent a lot of time thinking about the degree of nexus that exists between those four components. And in those connections, you're able to understand the risk of certain things happening or not happening. And what we've seen throughout this period is those things remain pretty much in lockstep for the most part. You see examples where they sort of come apart sometimes, and you'll have social behaviours that are inconsistent with government policy, which is consistent with medical advice. And generally they've been sort of waxing and waning in relativity, but we still continue to be led by essentially the underlying medical advice.
Let's talk about that though, because the human aspect of this is really important. And you're talking there from your business perspective, but let's look at the real element here. You had a situation where your own personal life, you and your family, were impacted in the early days by whatever was going on with COVID-19. You were sitting down, I'm sure, as a family and discussing it and looking at all the information that was coming your way. And then in addition to that, you have your business responsibilities and accountabilities that you're looking at as well. How did you feel about it personally with you and your family in the first few days of when COVID hit town and we went into all these lockdown situations?
Well, look, like a lot of people, we were binging on media. I was absorbing media at a phenomenal rate. I was reading every report I could get hold of, and that's fatiguing. And there's a whole nother story about how we can talk about media and the role of media and how it has an impact on society in times like these. And so we very quickly got to a point, I think, of relative knowledge that you can as an ordinary citizen, and then we quickly got fatigued by the onslaught of information and then all the different perspectives of information, and we started to just sort of become quite inward as a family, almost shielding ourselves from excessive information, making sure we always stayed informed so we knew we were doing the right thing. But at the same time, also saying, well, right, we don't know how long this is going to last. We're going to make the best of it. So we actually made a conscious decision to use this as an opportunity to slow down a bit. All of us in life are guilty of just running a million miles an hour, perhaps not considering the things that really matter. It's the old story that we're sometimes cruelest to the people that are closest to us in terms of the time that we provide. So we made a decision that we were just going to lock down together, spend some family times together, and just slow down. And so, like a lot of families around the world, we got into board games and in doing puzzles at home and all the things that had been lost in our hectic lifestyles. It was about that, getting back to basics.
Are you very good at board games, Morgan?
I don't have the patience for them, but my daughter, yeah, she whips me every time. But we'd never actually done a puzzle together since she's now 17, since she was about 7.
Wow.
So It was a really cathartic experience for us to sit down and do a couple of 1,000-piece puzzle, which of course we progressively did over a number of weeks. But in that, there's these small moments that, the reconnecting and sort of the fundamental aspects of life, the problem solving. And it was almost like a microcosm of the bigger issues that we're facing as a society, the problem solving, the improvisation that's necessary. They're all symptomatic of the experience we were going for. Just going out and getting groceries was something you had to think about.
Yeah.
Keeping our mind and body healthy.
Yeah.
Maintaining balance of the information that you're consuming, ensuring that you're actually being responsible. The big shift, I think, now is the personal level of responsibility people need to take for the information that forms the view they have about a topic. As we all know, you just can't rely on one source. There used to be one truth, now there's versions of truth.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's the big shift in this era that we're in. So then that puts the onus on you to ensure that you have what you feel is the information that makes most sense to you.
I think now, because we're in the situation where we've been enduring this newfound world for a few months now, and whether that be from a business perspective or from a personal reality, there's a couple of lines of thought that are now starting to emerge that are becoming stronger and stronger with a bigger voice. And I allude to a conversation I saw yesterday with a professor from a university in Sydney who was trying to promote the fact that, hey, we're going to be doing more and more damage to people if we don't go back to work, if we don't get the economy going to the stages that it was before. Yes, people are going to die, and that's an unfortunate thing, but people die every day. I don't know whether you know, but every day in Australia, 445 people on average lose their life through everything from road accidents to diseases to whatever. And we all know what the numbers are with COVID-19 in this country. Where do you sit as a board member and also as a human being when it comes to saying, right, let's get back to work and get this place going, because it's going to be better for not only the economy but for people's well-being and psychological situation? Where do you sit on that one, Morgan? I'm going to put you on the spot.
Mark, this is the question of our time.
Yeah.
I really believe that in years to come, when future generations look back at our decision making now as a society, this will be one of the academic questions of our time. The framing of human life and its nexus with economics has never been so cruelly debated in my mind. And we've ended up being in this paradigm where it's one or the other. And then there's this sort of direct correlation. Do you try and preserve life at the expense of the economy? Do you try and promote economic activity and accept the loss of life? And I, for one, don't recall in peacetime, so to speak, that currency of debate being the prevalent one. And I think it's very interesting, and it has borne out a lot of, I think, personal bias and perceptions in people, even in families, where different family members have different views on this very topic. I am aware of the death rate in Australia. It was one of the first things that I sought to understand so that I could put in context the death rate that we were experiencing versus the ordinary death rate as a consequence of our own human mortality. It is something that I've quoted to others to try and bring some perspective and context to what we are facing. One of the interesting observations I've got is that we haven't actually ever had media reporting to us on the level of cases and deaths ever before in peacetime. Now, I remember in different conflicts in my life, there's been death tolls updated during war. But other than that, we've never really ever had to think about death and numbers outside of incidents like plane crashes or, cyclones or floods or something like that. So having this sort of at the top of every media outlet's website and the top of the nightly news, having this constant sort of update on where the death toll's at now, and it almost became, do you know that there's been another one? And it became this topic of social discourse about where the death rate and where the cases were at. And everyone sort of was had their finger to the pulse on those numbers. It revealed to me how ignorant we are of our own humanity's scale. Because when you understand that there are 7.5 billion people on the planet, over 300 million people in the United States, and in this small country, 25 million. Now, these are numbers that humans cannot easily comprehend. What does it look like? What do 25 million people look like? Well, we understand a stadium, might have 100,000 people in it. We see images of protests like in Hong Kong a year ago where reportedly 2 million people hit the street. And I've got a visual of what that looked like from a drone type shot. It's a lot of people. But when we go beyond that, we don't really have an appreciation of our own scale as a human race on this planet. So our inability to comprehend what I would call the denominator impacts our ability to understand the sort of acceptability of the numerator being the number of people that die. So I think that when you get reports that, there's 1,000 people have got it or 100 people have died, you think, wow, 100 people dying, that's a lot. Well, actually, if you step back from your own personal sort of appreciation of scale and actually understand at a global level where we're at, the numbers are extremely small. We've never actually had to think about our mortality in this way. And I think that is going to be one of the residual things that comes from this, is an appreciation of mortality, appreciation that 440 odd Australians die every day. We don't talk about the number of people dying from heart disease, lung cancer, suicide, depression, smoking, car fatalities. We don't have those numbers at our fingertips like we've got COVID numbers at our fingertips. Why? Why don't we?
Yeah.
Occasionally we talk about suicide. We have a day every year where we all reflect as a community on what it means to be losing particularly young people to suicide. We have a day where we think about cancer, the pink day and so forth for breast cancer. We have moments of reflection, but we've never had a systemic understanding of our own mortality and the rate at which we perish. This has changed that.
Yeah, exactly. And why do you think, in terms of the other thing that I'd like to add to that, is that we aren't also making visible only in Australia and across the world about the recovery rate of people that have actually had COVID-19 and have gone on to fully recover and get back on their feet again and live their normal life. So we've got to...
I put that down to the soundbite world that we live in now. That information is that one or two steps down. The recovery rate is sort of the third statistic. You've got the case number one. You've got the death rate, number two. And then, we're out of time. You never get to the recovery rate. I think the other interesting dynamic is to look at the age profile of those people that are dying, the comorbidity that everyone was aware of initially that's sort of gone out of the picture. If you look at the average age of people that have perished as a consequence of this virus, it is higher. If you look at the incidence of comorbidity, it is higher. That's not to say it's not something that needs to be managed, but it does point to the ultimate impact that this virus can have on society. It is going to be more in the margins than actually at the core because of that very, very high recovery rate and the tendency for this to affect people with underlying conditions and at a more advanced age. Now, of course, there's always going to be outliers. You're always going to have your case of a 30-year-old fit person dying, and the media is going to really amplify that story. And we've all seen that. But at the core, there is a really positive story here, and that is that people who generally have a robust immune system are able to experience COVID in an asymptomatic way and recover. My attitude to COVID is really that that there are aspects of government response that have merit, like the social distancing, like the hygiene standards, like the stay at home if you're unwell. Those three things, to me, if they end up being part of the way in which our human race lives going forward, there's aspects of that which have merit. The social distancing probably being the most difficult. But the idea of keeping yourself clean and the built environment clean around us makes sense, as does the idea of not going out and interacting with other people if you're unwell. So if we're able to take some of those behaviours and build them into what it means to be a citizen, then that's not a bad thing.
So going back to my question, because you've given me a very nice summary and overview, but I want to know, would you open up the economy again right now and let people get back to work and back to life, knowing that we are going to have this death toll rise if we have a severe outbreak in any particular community?
I think it's a managed approach, and I don't mean to be sitting on the fence. I really do think you need to firstly accept that, and I mentioned to you before these four elements that are connected, and I come back to that: medical advice, government decision-making, social behaviours, and then economic activity. What I would like to see is that the nexus between some of those things be reduced. I think government policy is too closely connected to medical data. In a way, we've allowed decisions that have a multifaceted aspect to them become almost singly driven by one source of data. When else in our history do we allow one section of society to ultimately make every decision? Well, I don't know that there is one. Even in times of war, the military commanders aren't necessarily put in charge of the entirety of society. One of the great jobs of politicians as representatives of the people is to try and find a way of balancing all the different factors. It's a terribly difficult job, of course, all the different factors. And they have access to all the information to do that. And there was a time where government decision being based solely on medical advice made sense. But then I think our government here in Australia has realised that there are other factors to play out. And we need to actually learn to accept that there will be mortality associated with this virus and that there are consequences of opening up. And instead of actually sort of tormenting ourselves about that, what I think will start to emerge is a growing level of acceptance, a lessening of the reporting of every individual case. And there will be outbreaks that pop up here and there, and there will be responses that are necessary, but there'll be responses that are targeted, tactical responses to outbreaks rather than holistic, broad-based policies that affect all of society. So that's the shift I'm looking for, is going from whole of economy, whole of society decision-making to tactical responses to outbreaks, so that we're able to keep a lid on it. We're not stressing the health industry beyond breaking point, and we're just able to sort of keep a lid on it until a vaccine emerges and society's tolerance for this and herd immunity start to bear out. Now, that could take years.
Yeah.
But it is the great balancing act of our time, and that's why we need leaders that are willing to be open-minded to understanding all the different factors at play. Now, some of those factors are, of course, being reported occasionally, and that is the underlying levels of depression that come with financial hardship, that come with a reduction in freedom, the loss of jobs and all the rest of it, and how that plays out in people's health, the inability for people to actually have medical treatment that was needed because of the focus on allowing beds to be available for COVID cases. Hi there.
My little mate's come to join us.
and of course, the things that weren't happening in society. You talk about the monitoring of our oceans and our air. There's a lot of environmental research work that simply stopped in March, April, May. There's data series that have been going for decades, monitoring the salt levels in the ocean, the temperatures of the ocean, that required human beings to be out there on container ships doing that testing. But because of COVID lockdown, those people weren't able to be on those ships, weren't able to do that research to continue those important data series.
Let's talk about the factor, though, that you and I would be familiar with in working around the world in different countries and environments. We tend to, when we're in that global role and looking at business from a holistic point of view across the world, we always look at best demonstrated practices in different countries and in different organizations and, adopt some of those and see how that might fit into our business. Do you think that countries around the world, when it comes to business in particular at the moment, are becoming too insular and nationalistic in their approach on how we're going about this? Do you think there's enough of, learning about what's going on in other countries to start to make some of these decisions, whether it be economically or society driven, for what we're going through at the moment?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, the greatest thing I've learned from this crisis is the fragility of our human race and how quickly things can descend into chaos. So that fragility of civility, without wanting to rhyme, we are the outward appearance of order and civility that guides our civilization has been revealed to be incredibly fragile. It doesn't take a lot for things to really turn to custard. That is a fact. That's number one. Number two is that we have been on a globalization push, and in your career, you've been right in the thick of that, of how we have learnt to develop products and services leveraging the resources of the planet and the capabilities of the planet, how we've been able to create movement of goods and people to further our economic interests in the world, raise some economies out of poverty. We have globalized a lot of the different processes in society and markets in the world. And COVID has basically put a line in the sand and said, we're now going to be shifting backwards to a more nationalistic approach to the development of our own resources. And I think globalization is the single biggest loser out of COVID. It is absolutely the cooperation that existed in the years leading up to this. Brexit is an example. The Trump administration has been largely about putting America first at the expense of its allies. So we are, and then you lay in COVID and you start to see people sort of retreating and regressing from steps that they were taking to work more closely in alliances with other nations and sharing different competitive advantages for the betterment of all. And of course, we are, in a period now where you're starting to see a dynamic develop between the world's two great superpowers play out during COVID and in a way define the players and the roles that these characters are taking in a geopolitical sense. So, this is going to be looked at by historians as having profound implications for humanity, geopolitics, economic trade, globalization, public health care. All of these different factors are affected. But it's also going to be a period of great innovation where we're going to start to really see some of the technological advances that we've all known about for decades really getting sort of supercharged, because the environment, it's sort of the perfect storm for certain things that we've always been about to happen to actually start happening.
Look, I couldn't agree more. And, I'm probably one of the most optimistic people you'll meet in the world and right on the edge of wanting to be involved in any innovation that's going on. And I've even been amazed by the speed in which innovation's happening around the world during this time, the scale of it as well. I think there's some global businesses that are starting now. They're going to have significant impact on our future as a society and as a human race. You've only got to look at Elon Musk and what he's being able to achieve during COVID-19 times and the impact that's going to have on humanity. Getting back to the organizations that you're directly linked to at the moment and getting your crystal ball out, what does it tell you in terms of, where we're going in the short to medium term? How far ahead are you seeing that ray of light, as you alluded to it before? Is it far off in the distance, or do you see a glimmer of hope right now?
Oh, look, I think that human beings have a tendency to have a short memory. And even though this is the biggest crisis of our history, our recent history over the last few hundred years, and it will necessarily take longer to recover, the cadence at which we will recover is for sure. There will be a time where we're looking back on this period as something that happened in the past. And I believe that will come faster than you think. Just like going into the lockdown was much faster than we ever thought. I think we're going to come out of it. It may not be the V-shaped recovery or the U-shaped recovery that economists are sort of debating right now. But one thing's for sure, we're going to come out of it. And that's because of the resiliency of the human race and the willingness of people just to, this sort of concept of regressing to the norm, which is a well-known phenomena that we, despite whatever challenge, whatever climatic environment we're in, we always sort of regress to this norm. Now, people are saying, what's the new norm? So, there'd be things that are residual, long-lasting impacts of COVID, but I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about just a desire to get back to life, to reconnect with people in the way that we're most familiar with, to live a fulfilling life. So in terms of, changes in our business environment, one of the definite things I'm seeing on one of the boards I'm involved with, a company called Ubi Park, which is involved in a sort of really disruptive approach to car parking industry. That business is booming. It's booming because people are now wanting a touchless car parking experience. And that company has been innovating in that space for years, and fighting all the traditional battles with existing car parking operators, trying to have its customers understand the value in the technology of being able to find a car park, go into a car park without taking a ticket, without needing to touch anything. And lo and behold, along comes COVID. Now everyone wants contactless experiences in their daily transactions. So now all of a sudden that business is a genius and is ready to be rolled out here, there, and everywhere. So I think that people are going to be looking to leverage technology to have less interaction with humans in their daily conveyance of life. That, as I say, was a trend that has been bubbling along for a couple of decades, and now is just going to have this incredible sort of supercharge. I've been in and around shopping centres most of my life as a developer and owner of shopping centres, and we've for years at conferences been talking about the emergence of e-commerce. And as far as I can remember back, there's been this threat always, shopping centres are dinosaurs, they're never going to exist. And before COVID, global retail sales that were conducted online were still only about 20% of total global sales. So 80% of retail sales globally are still done somewhere other than on the internet,
right?
I.e. shopping centres and the like.
Yep.
And that's a statistic that really blows a lot of people away. They go, wow, I would have thought online sales would be higher. Well, I think COVID is going to make them higher, and it has already made them higher. Because if you were a consumer that was sort of sitting on the fence, weren't quite sure whether you'd ever make that first purchase, were scared about your privacy of your credit card and so forth, well, COVID's just supercharged that. So all of those people are now being recruited to the e-commerce world, have become more comfortable with it, realize that it actually works. There's a wonderful logistics system that sits behind a lot of these online sale merchants, and your product does actually arrive. So that confidence that comes from doing that for the first time will obviously lead to new behaviors. The longer that COVID goes on, the more comfortable people get with these new ways of transacting. So I think you're going to see e-commerce and everything that it means be around for a lot longer. And that, of course, is going to have an impact on the built environment and what these buildings need to be able to do. Another business I'm involved in owns office buildings. Now, of course, the work from home dynamic is very topical at the moment. Now, this is something, again, that has been bubbling along for a couple of decades. Companies have been seen as quite innovative and contemporary, where they've allowed their workforce to have a degree of flexibility to work from home and secure a lot of those productivity gains of not having to commute between home and work. Of course, COVID has required that to become the standard for many people. So we're seeing the way in which companies use their offices and the way that workforces interact with colleagues dramatically change. The debate now is, will this be something that lasts forever? I think it's going to be something that will become part of the way in which we work. So again, we're going from a low base where it was only some companies that would work from home. Maybe your graphic design firm or an advertising firm that was really avant-garde has been doing this for decades. They look like geniuses again. And you're going to see some more traditional companies perhaps adopt some more flexible workforce arrangements. And I think this is a great thing. What's the impact on office buildings? Well, offices might need to be used in a different way. Maybe people will use offices for moments of collaboration, for meetings where people come together for a purpose rather than just as a place to be. So I think offices will still play a role, just as I think shopping centres will still play a role. But that role will be redefined. Now, if you look back through history, over the last 100 years, these sorts of evolutions and transformations of the way in which we use the spaces in our society have always been changing and evolving. This is a dramatic change, but in many respects will create a better work-life experience, will create more productivity, and will cause our use of our buildings to become more efficient and more purposeful.
One last question today before we wrap up, and it's got to do with leadership in this current time, in terms of you're in an enviable position because you get to see how organisations are run. You've already mentioned that you've been impressed with the CEOs that you're working alongside. What are some of the key attributes that people really need to focus on at these difficult times to lead businesses out of, the COVID-19 lockdown, but also the creating the new future that we're going to have in this world?
I think that leadership is about understanding your role in the broader ecosystem of society, business, and then your company. And the best leaders during these periods are informed, are objective, are humble. They don't know all the answers, and they're willing to be vulnerable. And at their core, they have a desire to be transparent, to communicate fearlessly and be courageous. And being courageous is about being humble as well. And to ultimately be servants of the organisations and the stakeholders that they serve and represent. And the leaders that reject the opportunity to be informed, the leaders that flip and flop between the way they evaluate different opportunities, only serve to inspire a lack of confidence in the people that they serve. So I think a steady, calm hand, a recognition that we are going to get through this is vitally important. There's no good a leader looking down into the bowels of their soul, wondering if we're ever going to get out of this. The leaders that I'm observing that are most effective are the ones that keep people focused on the other side of the valley and are building a bridge of confidence that people can navigate across to reach the other side. And that requires all of those great personal attributes. Yeah. And I'm seeing it a lot. There's some incredible leaders in these countries as we look around the world. There's some amazing business leaders that, inspire us to want to learn and be better as a result of this. And it's only through challenge that we're actually forced to innovate and get better. And I think that there's great reason to be hopeful and great reason to be optimistic about where we end up. I think we've learned to appreciate people and the one-to-one relationships. When you're denied access to something, that ability to connect with someone. And I saw someone yesterday, and I've worked with her for a few years, but we've been separated for the last 4 or 5 months. And I had the opportunity to socially distance, but be in the same boardroom with this colleague. And she walked in and she said, "Oh, hi, Morgan." And I said, "Hi, Caroline. It's great to see you." And she turned around and said, "You know what? It's great to see you too." And in that, we both recognized how much we'd actually missed being able to sit across from a work colleague or indeed a friend. And it served to remind us of what's really important. And I think I'm enormously optimistic about how this has brought us back to basics and how then we can go forward with a greater degree of thoughtfulness about what we're all doing here. What is this all about? What is life about? What are we trying to achieve here as humanity? And it's made us realize how interconnected we are. We are the boundaries and the lines that have been drawn through history that divide us into nations are ultimately meaningless in the face of a crisis like this.
As it's shown,
and that has been revealed to everyone. And I think that when the dust settles and we're able to sort of get beyond the current state of crisis, what we'll be left with is that a deep understanding of interconnectedness, a deep understanding of vulnerability, shared vulnerability, and the importance of focusing on what really matters in life.
Fantastic way to end the show today, mate. And I want to thank you very much from the bottom of my heart of all the great things that you've shared over the last hour. And there's been a lot of amazing insight and also tips for people out there at the moment who may be struggling in any area of their life. So thank you very much for taking the time and coming and being on the Global Business Podcast today.
Absolute pleasure, Mark. Thank you very much.
Now, if you're listening out there, I've already contracted Morgan to appear on my other show, the Conversations with Humanity, and I'm sure if you've been listening to Morgan today, you've been inspired and motivated. So he's going to come back and have a chat to me sometime soon, and we're going to talk about absolutely everything and anything that comes up. And I can guarantee you that rugby union is going to be one of the topics that we talk about. So if you're out there and you've enjoyed listening to Morgan today, come back for some more because he's going to. And Morgan, I want to wish you and your family a very happy week ahead, and stay safe and stay well, mate.
All the best, Mark. Thanks a lot.